Today, we live in a world of superheroes. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has made names like Thor, Iron Man, and Star-Lord a household name. But do you know what gave us this privileged age of superheroes and prevented the whole industry from an early death? The 1970s were dark times. Massive economic downturns and rising gas prices hit everyone in the pocketbooks. This meant the late 1970s were also a really bad time for comics. The current economic situation, declining sales, and new forms of media were coming into the limelight. And because of this, the local comic shops and the industry itself was suffering. The comic book industry was edging closer to the point of no return. But then, Marvel adapted Star Wars and everything changed. This is the story of a comic book industry that needed a new hope and was saved by a small group of real-life rebels at the very first San Diego Comic-Con movie panel, and the best-selling comic that saved the company. This is the story of how Star Wars saved Marvel Comics. The late 1970s was a dark time for Americans and American companies. Stagflation, high interest rates, and exploding gas prices were crushing the average Joe. It was also a very dark time for comic books. The entire industry was on the ropes and on the verge of throwing in the towel. This wasn't the same comic market based on shops that we all know today. Only a few shops were open at the time, and the direct comic market was basically non-existent. Worse yet, every comic that didn't sell on the newsstand, the primary source of sales, was returned for a credit. Rising paper prices, declining reader interest in played-out superhero cliches, and an antiquated system of distribution left Marvel struggling to sell even half of the comics they were printing, leaving them near bankruptcy. This wasn't just a dark time for Marvel Comics. DC Comics was also just months away from implosion, and actually saw them cancel 31 of their titles in 1978. Former Marvel editor-in-chief Jim Shooter talked a little bit about this to IO9. Marvel was a mess throughout the mid-70s, and during my 2 years as an associate editor from the beginning of 1976 through the end of 1977. Almost every book was late. There were unscheduled reprints and fill-ins, and there was just plain missed issues here and there. Many books, despite my best efforts to shore up the bottom, were unreadable. Not merely bad, unreadable. Almost all were less than they ought to be. Upstairs, the cheesy non-comics magazine department was losing millions. It seemed like the company as a whole was in a death spiral. And at this time, the situation appeared to be the end of Marvel Comics. After years of development, Lucas finally began filming Star Wars in 1976. And it was a mess. With cost overruns and studio interference, everything was behind, including merchandising. Lucas needed Star Wars to be a hit, or his career was done. One of his big ideas to promote the film galvanized the fan community with a Star Wars comic book to generate hype. Now, many don't know this, but Lucas was actually a silent partner in a comic book store and fully recognized the power of geekdom. So he sent his shop co-owner, Ed Summer, as well as advertising publicity supervisor on Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope, Charlie Lippincott, to Marvel publisher Stan Lee with his proposal. And Stan said no. Quite honestly, Stan just wanted to concentrate on comics featuring original characters instead of licensed ones due to costs. This seemed like the end, but luckily there was one person Stan Lee still listened to. Former Marvel editor-in-chief Roy Thomas. Stan Lee and Roy Thomas were known for having an exceptional relationship. How close were they? Well, here's a picture of Thomas visiting Lee just a few days before his death last year. Thomas had actually convinced Lee to gamble on licensing on the comic book rights to an obscure fantasy character by the name of Conan. This book turned into a huge hit for Marvel Comics. Conan actually sold almost as many copies as Amazing Spider-Man at the time, and constantly beating Marvel regulars like the Avengers and Fantastic Fours in sales. Think about that. So, Lucas came up with a new idea. He sent his buddies over to Roy Thomas to deliver a new deal. And if Roy could convince Marvel Comics to make the Star Wars comics, Lucas would give Marvel publishing rights absolutely free. Using this new ammo, Roy Thomas was able to convince Stan Lee to actually give it a shot. Using concept art, camera stills, and several versions of the Star Wars script provided by Lucas's team, Roy Thomas and artist Howard Chaykin crafted a story and visuals that became the Marvel adaptation of the Star Wars story. The complete story encompassed the first 6 issues of the original comic book series. Interestingly enough, the duo did not see a cut of the movie until the first and second issues were already at the printers, leading to there being some scenes in the comic that were not actually in the final cut of the movie. The one that comes to mind first is a conversation between Biggs Darklighter and the glimpse of the quieter life that Luke had on Tatooine with his friends Fixer and Cammy. Now we all know about SDCC. It's the annual pilgrimage of comic geekdom to San Diego to see, buy, sell, and share our love for the entire genre. But long before Marvel Hall H's, mile-long lines, and thousands of friends in cosplay, we still had Comic-Con. It was just more about comics. Comic-Con today might be the biggest movie showcase in the world, but way back in the 1970s, it was about comics and comics only. As part of the promotion for the Star Wars comic and the movie, Roy Thomas and comic artist Howard Chaykin and Lucasfilm's PR person Charles Leprecott gave what is possibly the very first San Diego Comic-Con movie panel. Roy Thomas has spoken about this frequently, and this is what he had to say. I don't think we had any stills from the movie. I think it was just the posters that Howard Chaykin had. We had the Star Wars t-shirts we were wearing, and we had copies of the poster, which we were selling for $1, and we just talked about the movie. We could have shown some recorded production drawings, and I just didn't realize it since I had seen them several times before. But I'm not sure if 20th Century Fox would have wanted us to show those to the public. I wonder often if anybody still has any of those posters that Thomas and Chaykin handed out at that event at SDCC. Finally, in April of 1977, the first issue of Marvel's Star Wars comic hit the newsstands. Yes, April. Given the intense desire to avoid spoilers in the market we live in today, it sounds inconceivable. But the first 2 issues of Marvel's 6-part Star Wars adaptation actually came out before the movie hit theaters. The movie wasn't released until several weeks later on May the 25th. Lucas had in fact insisted on it in the original contract, hoping the comic book readers would get intrigued enough by what they read to go and see the film. This was actually a good thing for fans. Readers actually got a bit more than they bargained for, because Thomas and Chaykin were working on an earlier version of the script, and their adaptation actually had a couple of scenes that never made it into the film. Star Wars #1, after an initial print, went on to sell over 1 million copies with reprints, essentially turning a free 6-issue adaptation of a movie into a comic that had 4 times the sales of their current top title, The Amazing Spider-Man. Jim Shooter, former editor-in-chief at Marvel, would speak quite openly about Roy Thomas's astounding work and foresight. He said, "He willed it. He willed it to happen. Nobody else wanted to do it. This was before I was editor-in-chief. I hope I would have had the sense to listen to him. Star Wars was a tremendous hit and kept the company alive during a very tough time. The book kept the company going." He's even more recently said, the success of the Star Wars comic was a significant factor in Marvel's survival. Roy Thomas saved Marvel. Now, if you were a fan of Marvel Comics in the 1980s, you know this wasn't the end of some of these adaptations. Marvel followed up on the success of Star Wars by giving more space to licensed properties on the newsstand, leading to some other successful lines such as Battlestar Galactica, G.I. Joe, Indiana Jones, and the Transformers. They even did movie adaptations for some other movies including Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, and Dune. So when you sit back and you watch your favorite Marvel superhero on screen today, remember, without Roy Thomas and Star Wars, Marvel Comics very well may have shut its doors forever. Thanks, Roy.
The Force will be with you, always.